the name of my session is Hopes and Fears. What do secondary school writing center directors think of writing centers becoming all subject tutoring centers? I'm Jenny Goransson. I'm currently at George Mason University in Virginia, where I'm a PhD student, and I also work at the writing center there. I'm really happy to see you all today. So when Muriel Harris was giving recommendations for how to begin writing center research or how to begin a writing center research project, she had a really great quote that has stuck with me. Begin research with a question that is bugging you, one for which you really want an answer. And I really think about that when I think about this particular research project, and you'll see why. So what I'm hoping you all will get out of today's session, I'm going to pull back the curtain a bit on sort of how I arrived at this study, and also how did the questions that bugged me about my own experiences evolve into an actual research project. Of course, I'll be sharing what method I use to conduct this research, and I'll try to spend the majority of my time on the findings, because that's really what we all want to know. And it was an IRB approved survey study, which is crucial when you're using human subjects, which I was. And I'm also hoping to engage in some discussion with you all about the implications of the study, and also just to answer any questions that come up for you as you're listening today. It could be about research, it could be about all subject centers, really kind of jot those down as they come up. And the structure will be, I'll share background, which includes my path, some key terminology, just to make sure we all know what I'm talking about when I say learning centers and so on. Some highlights from the literature, how I set up the study, how I came up with the method, who participated, how did I analyze the data, and then the findings, which this is actually a typo. It should say 21 responses. So I received 73 responses, but 21 of them were from you all, middle school and high school folks. And this presentation is going to really zoom in on those responses. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion. And if you are somebody who wants to follow along in the slides at your own pace, I've created a Google folder with this slide deck and also a couple other things which I'll reference during the presentation. And this is a QR code you may use if you'd like. And I think Jamie was going to put this link in the chat also for your convenience. So a little brief timeline. So in 2010, I founded the West Springfield Writing Center in Springfield, Virginia, and ran it as a writing center until 2017. In 2017, my principal decided that the writing center would close and that we would replace it with a peer tutoring program. That's a much more complicated story that I go into in an article that hopefully you'll all see in the next JPTSS. But then, yeah, I directed West Springfield peer tutoring for the next 2 years, and then passed the torch to Melissa Morgan, who's here today. And she continued the program and is doing such an amazing job. And in 2019, until now, I have been a full-time PhD student and also teaching composition at George Mason University. And it's only this past fall that I started working in a writing center again, and it's a post-secondary center, which is a very different feel. I am still a high school writing center person at heart, though. So I share this next section to really help you all think about, sometimes we read a research article and we're like, it looks so clean and planned and polished. And I think it's important for us to remember that actually the process towards a project can be more multifaceted and more messy. So of course, my personal experiences influenced my interest in the project. But then I also was just wondering, like, okay, was my experience similar to others? Why did English teachers stop sending their students to our center? Or why did the writing tutoring change? And various other issues. And so I did a lot of writing and a lot of reflecting, some of which was with the tutors who had been through the process with me. I had them do some artwork and other things to just help us reflect on the process. I also wanted to see what it was like in a different center. So there was a different center in my region that was going through the same transformation. So for a school project, I did some observations and interviews with him, and that was really eye-opening. And then, of course, reading to see like what is out there, what's been published about this topic. And I really started to notice not much has been published in terms of actual studies. Like no one's gone out and figured out like how often is this happening, or how do people feel about it? I also had a lot of conversations with mentors, colleagues, many of whom are here today. The IWCA conference helped me just talk out this idea with post-secondary folks and hear that, oh, this is something that they're talking about too, you know, writing centers being shifted into other forms. A lot of my friends from SWCA, and a really important mentor for me in this project was the Mason Writing Center director, Susan Lawrence. And she's been a really important advisor throughout the whole project. And then finally, after all that messy process, I started really focusing in on what are my research questions and what do I want to ask in this survey. So I did want to pause to talk about key terms. The terminology it's called many things, but a learning center generally is a center that supports student learning in all subjects and skills, rather than being focused primarily on writing. Learning centers exist on colleges and university campuses and also in high schools. And they offer all sorts of different services. It really depends on the institution. Lori Salem calls them big tent tutoring centers. That seems to be a term used more in the post-secondary world. The idea being like everything's under a big tent, like one big tent. Learning assistance center is another term you'll hear, literacy center, and many others. And in the SWCA world, we tend to call them all subject centers. One of my survey respondents called hers an omnidisciplinary center. But the basic idea is the same. This term, which I'll use a few times, is it's called expansion. So it's the term for when an existing writing center expands to become a learning center. And this is what happened at West Springfield and has happened in many other secondary centers. Consolidation is slightly different, but it's related. So it's when a writing center merges with other programs, maybe a math center and a writing center come together to make one center. Maybe the communication center, maybe the learning center, they pull together, create a new thing. And that's really more common in the post-secondary context. I actually didn't hear even one example of it in my responses from high school and middle school folks. So take a moment to just personally reflect about any personal connections or reactions that you have to any of these three key terms. If it could be, oh, I heard about a center where this happened, or my center is thinking about it. And if you're so inspired, feel free to share those thoughts and connections in the chat. We won't pause to discuss the things in the chat until the discussion portion of the presentation, but feel free to add. Okay. Lit review. So I am going to speed through this because I know that my citations are at the end of the presentation. And if you want to dive in and really read all of these, you go for it. But I want to get to the findings of the study as quick as I can. So there's a lot of discussion of these trends, particularly consolidation, when you look at listservs, where writing center folks are sharing, oh, the dean came and wants to do this. What do I do? Also the Facebook group, chats that I've had at conferences. This is really very much being talked about. But there haven't really been empirical studies of it, which was hard for me because I was like, but I want to know what's been studied. And then it's really kind of, there's a gap there. One exception is that what I did find is that in studies that focused on other topics, they would sometimes indirectly talk about big tent centers. And it was typically in a negative fashion. So it was often sort of comparing a big tent center to a writing center. And then there was a wealth of practitioner narratives about it. So a great one by Heather Barton, who's on our SWCA board and is amazing. Her piece in the SWCA toolkit was a great narrative about a success story of Writing Center choosing to expand to a learning center mainly out of usage concerns and also just kind of making sure the center was going to survive. Another recurring theme in the literature and in my survey responses is this idea of a one-stop shop. Like, rather than going one place for math and a different place for science help and another place for world language help, one-stop shop for student tutoring. Another really important article is by Chosid, and he argued that it's crucial that a consolidated writing center make sure that writing center principles are still at the center. And he worries that if they aren't, then the focus can be taken away from like all of the amazing research and pedagogy that we have. And then others kind of analyze the politics of what happens when you relocate or when you share a space, and had recommendations for that. But they were all very much based on their personal experience, not looking at a wide range of centers' experiences. There is a recent article that came out that's arguing that mergers are the way to survive during tough financial times. This is particularly so in the post-secondary context, but this one stuck out at me because I hadn't thought of it as sort of a survival technique until I read that piece. The 2010 International Writing Center Association keynote did make a pretty clear argument that they identified at that time a growing trend of upper level administrators, so deans, et cetera, saying we're going to merge the Writing Center with other units. And they really were telling audiences at that time, we recommend that those committed to Writing Center work will resist those pressures. So it's really like very clear how they felt at that time. All that being said, I knew that it was a little more complicated than that. And so that inspired me to sort of dig a little deeper. So what were my goals in starting this study? I really wanted to zoom out from my own personal experiences and really get a more textured understanding of not only other directors' experiences, but also their perceptions of consolidation and expansion. I wanted to also hear how they responded when people have proposed that they consolidate or expand. And then for those who had already gone through it, I wanted to hear about benefits, drawbacks, other thoughts. And I was also interested, even for those who hadn't gone through it, what were they considering as a drawback, or what were they considering as a potential benefit? Because those are important too. And of course, I wanted to make sure this was not just another Writing Center study that focuses on the post-secondary world, but I wanted to say, let's hear from these secondary school voices. And fortunately, many actually did respond. So thank you all if you were one of those people. Okay, so method. It was an online survey, partly to try to really get lots of different responses, make it easier to access from all over the world. I had to get IRB approval from my institution, which was very, very easy actually. And the office was really supportive in helping me make it happen. I did pilot a first draft of the survey with a group of 9 directors from a few different contexts, and then followed up with a brief interview to hear about their experience taking the survey, and then revise the survey based on their feedback. The final survey was 40 questions, including demographic questions, open-ended questions, which were the bulk of what I was interested in, because I wanted to hear, real contextualized stories and observations. But I did have multiple choice questions and some Likert questions, just to sort of look at big picture trends. And the survey itself, if you're interested, is in that Google folder. And you'll see it is, you have to kind of read the notes to figure out, okay, how did it branch? Because sometimes if people answered one question, it sent them to a different question. So apologies if it's a little confusing to follow. I shared the recruitment letter electronically through a few listservs that were primarily, Writing Center directors on them. And I shared them in a couple Facebook groups, and also emailed some of my professional contacts. And I also really was curious to have the folks who had published on the topic, like Choseed, I reached out to them too and said, you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially given that it's been a few years since you wrote about it. And I did hear back from a lot of those. So that was kind of neat. The survey was live for 4 weeks. I sent 2 reminder messages, just sort of nudging people to respond. Once the responses came in, analysis, I really did drill into those open-ended responses. So the paragraph responses, not the multiple choice as much. And then I used coding, multiple rounds of coding to identify what was happening in the people's responses. And then I eventually grouped those codes into categories, and those categories eventually came into my themes. And if you're interested in sort of how that breaks down, I did include a table of the codes, how those fit into categories, and how those fit into themes. But I will be going into more detail on all of that when I write all this up into an article. So yeah, there were 52 responses from college and university folks and 21 from middle and high school directors. And these are the regions that responded. Probably not surprisingly, my own region was the most, the highest response, but it was nice to get, 1 international response, a few people from other parts of the country. And findings. So what did I learn? And I do focus primarily on what the middle and high school folks said, but I did want to share what the themes were from when I pulled all 73 responses in, because I think they set the tone for what you're going to see in the remainder of the presentation. So a huge takeaway for me has been, perhaps not surprisingly, that the local and material conditions and circumstances have an enormous impact on Writing Center administrators' autonomy and also on their view of expansion and consolidation. So those local conditions might be things like, did it result in a cut in pay, or did it result in a change in office location? Did it, was it done in a manner that felt like they weren't part of the conversation? Or was it done in a manner of, hey, the Writing Center is doing amazing work. Can you expand that to like share with other departments? And also you'll have this huge promotion. So that was something I heard from one university director, and she had a really positive experience with it because she could set the tone for the center and make sure that the training maintained high quality and all of that. Second big theme is that the other thing that really impacts our perception of the dangers and the opportunities is the way that we view expertise. Do we view the other folks involved as having expertise in tutoring of writing, or in their subject area, or in learning sciences? So really, like, the way we see others' expertise and also the way we see our own expertise really impacts the way that we perceive consolidation or expansion. And then this third one has to do with Writing Center identity. And I always feel like identity is one of these terms that's sort of thrown around, but in the asterisk, I sort of explain what I mean by identity. So it's like the constructions of what it means to be a Writing Center director, a tutor, or a Writing Center. And so from looking at all the responses, it seems like there were people who felt like these shifts are really good for the Writing Center world, are really like a growth, that they're exciting. And then there are folks who are saying, oh my gosh, it's stripping away super important parts of Writing Center life. So that's the big picture, but I think what's more useful, of course, is hearing from the responses themselves. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'll share quotes and details from people in our world, so the middle and high school world. And I do hope sometime in the next few years, if you happen to be a reader of Writing Center Journal, that there will be an article about the bigger study. I am almost done with it, but yeah, if you ever want to hear more about the full study, feel free to reach out to me. But let's zoom in on high school responses. So in the question where I asked, do you have personal experience with consolidation or expansion? This is what I got. So 42% said no, 23.8% said yes, and 33.3% said somewhat. So I'll zoom in on each of those a little bit. So first big finding, when I looked at the yeses, all of them had not experienced consolidation, but had experienced expansion. And so this really led me to what I suspected was true, but wasn't really sure of until I did this study, which is that consolidation is really more of a college and university thing. And then the second part of it is that in all of these cases, the expansion was director initiated. Sometimes tutors also, were part of that, but in none of the responses was it a top-down, administrator saying, this is what's happening, sort of, instead it was more of a grassroots thing, which was interesting to me because that actually wasn't my experience. So here were some of the reasons that those folks gave for why the expansion happened. As I mentioned, sometimes the students or the tutors suggested it. Sometimes there were concerns about, oh my gosh, my center's not being used enough and they're going to shut it down. There was also a response from middle school, one middle school director who talked about, this was a good decision because we're a middle school. And I'll share that quote in a moment. And as I mentioned, one director did say that the administrator had said, well, we need to shut down the writing center. And so as a defensive mechanism, this director had said, they said, well, what if we tutor all subjects? But then the actual process was still very much directed by the director. So still pretty high autonomy as far as how to set up the program, what the timeline would look like. For one participant, a friend of mine, the change from writing center to learning center made it so that this could become her full-time job. And she recognized that that was not necessarily like the norm, but that it was, it demonstrated that administration saw this as a even more important role once she expanded to all subjects. So here are some quotes. This was a high school director. Within our first semester of opening as a writing center, it became clear that there was a student demand for help in all subjects. So we made the shift toward a learning center model the following year. I did not have to seek any administrative or institutional approval. We were just able to respond naturally to student need. It was a smooth transition, though it took faculty years in some cases to stop calling it the writing center. This was the middle school response I was alluding to. I soon realized that we could help more students if we expanded to an all subject center. It was a good move since students at my school needed more help with math and other subjects. This change happened because we found that when students learned about our writing center and what we did, they always asked if we could help them with work in other subjects. Also, it became apparent pretty quickly that students were not doing a lot of polished writing in middle school compared to what they were doing in high school. A lot of writing is happening, but more of it is brief or does not go through the writing process in the same way. So that's really interesting, that just the way writing is taught or approached at that institution impacted, her choice to convert into all subjects. This is the other one I was mentioning before. Due to a change in leadership at the school, the new administration wanted to dismantle the writing center as it did not support, quote, all students. Through discussions, the actual issue was that administration felt as if faculty resented that the writing center had prominence over tutoring for other subjects. In order to keep the center open, I pitched expanding our services to all subjects. So as you can tell, politics and power, is all woven into this sometimes, right? And I'm sure if you reflect on your own institution, you've had sort of versions of this in making decisions for your center. So shifting to the no's, well, actually, really, this affects everybody. So finding 2 was that all participants, including those with minimal or no personal experience with consolidation or expansion, could identify particular benefits that might come from it, as well as some concerns. And this is sort of where the title for the presentation comes, is this idea of hopes and fears. Because the truth is that we have hopes about this and we also have fears, and they're both important. So benefits of expansion, as summarized by the respondents, was increased usage by students, increased faculty and admin buy-in, because they suddenly can see the center as supporting all subjects, although as one of my respondents said, writing centers also support all subjects when you really sort of analyze what they're all about. Cross-curricular connections, so the idea of the center initiating these conversations about learning and making learning less of a siloed experience, like just in the math department, just in English, etc. Many also mentioned that it diversified who they could hire as tutors. And a few mentioned that this would actually help move the secondary school writing center movement forward. So let me zoom into some of those quotes to share that. Expansion will allow us to reach more students and have a stronger presence in the school. This was a high school director who was considering expansion. These two are about that cross-curricular connection. One of my respondents was really passionate about this. And in her center, they had two teachers directing the center, one from English, one from math. And so that just led to these new conversations about what learning looked like in each of these disciplines. She also mentioned that the Honor Society helped with some of that cross-curricular knowledge when most of their tutors were mainly writing center tutors. This quote I think is worth reading. Math is science, is communication, is history, is digital literacy. It all goes together. The silo of knowledge that is perpetuated in our system is reinforced with subject-specific tutoring centers. Show me a math problem that is higher level, that doesn't take literacy and writing and communication skills, that need to be honed in on in order to do that math problem, or science or history. Literacy is universal, communication is universal, learning is universal, knowledge is universal. Stop siloing school. Others were sharing that, you know, sometimes people would come in first for math, and then they'd be like, oh wait, I can also bring my writing paper in. So sometimes there was like the gateway in to the center by opening up to other subjects. Just to summarize, what these two quotes are about is being able to then recruit tutors who maybe are not particularly strong writers, but have other skill sets that really benefited the center. So that included EL students, SPED students, and one of the other respondents talked about being able to recruit more males, which is an interesting, I mean, that's a whole different research study, I think, is thinking about the gender representation in our centers. This respondent was talking about that secondary school writing center movement idea. In general, I want writing centers to be writing centers. However, I also want to spread writing centers throughout high schools. If expansion is a way to make that happen, then that is a path I support. So as you're hearing these quotes, if there are particular reactions you're having or responses, if you wanted to jot them down, I have in the Google folder, there's a document called discussion document. Feel free to add those thoughts there. In general, those expanded center directors, they were really pro-expansion. They were sort of saying, yeah, I might have been concerned going into it, but here are all the ways that these that this turned out great. This quote was really powerful. I wish more of my secondary colleagues saw it as an opportunity and a gift to their student bodies rather than a sky is falling calamity or an act of territorial disrespect. In the same way we ask our tutors to be flexible and have faith that they will figure out what to do in each session, we should also be willing to take some risks and adapt to student needs. I don't want to leave out the concerns because there were many. So director autonomy was one concern. You know, once you start collaborating with other disciplines, like, am I still in charge? Director and tutor workload, the concern about diluted tutor training, concerns about the center suddenly seeming like a fix-it or remedial center, concerns about the tutors or the directors feeling confident in their work, and big concern about the de-emphasis of writing. If this model is something that directors and tutors choose to implement, then I think they should be supported. I do not think outside administration forcing these mergers and expansions without proper funding, PD time, and resources is it all acceptable? My concern lies only with how these transitions happen, not that they are happening. And I think that's really wise what this person is talking about. And again, coming back to that idea of context, really important for directors to think about what do they want to do? They know best what's good for their center. I really deeply believe that. This was an interesting comment from the same person, I believe, who talked about, yeah, there are lots of advantages, but they're mostly for the clients. Because, hey, it's a space to get help with whatever is troubling you. This person was emphasizing, it sounds like a lot more work for the director because the training would be so much more wide ranging. And it also sounds like more work for the tutors who needs to switch from subject to subject all the time. This was another person concerned about the tutor training in writing being diluted. As I share in the article that's coming out soon in JPTSS, that was something that concerned me too, and that I observed firsthand. Similarly, this person said, we have an entire course dedicated to training for work in the Writing Center, a course which honors the rich and growing body of research surrounding Writing Center pedagogy. I worry that this too will get lost. This is another comment about the watering down of the training and the idea that it could really stretch someone into content directions that they feel very unfamiliar with. And that possibly changing to a learning center could give it a different feel as a fix-it center that would lose the community feel of a writing center. And that was one of the pilot respondents who talked about that. This one's big. This is a high school director who directs a writing center who said, my primary concern is that STEM always gets top priority, both within the discourse and functioning of my school, as well as in society more broadly. These disciplines, at least at the secondary level, tend to focus more on coverage of content than developing disciplinary skills and ways of seeing through writing. My colleagues in the STEM department would likely tell you as much. So were we to blend the Writing Center with other disciplines, I fear we would lose the room and organization which declares writing is important enough to deserve its own place. The last finding related to the people who answered somewhat. So lots of folks said, kind of experienced this. And it was either a similar scenario or maybe they were considering moving in this direction. One of them was what I called informal expansion. So basically like, yeah, we're still a writing center, but yeah, sometimes they tutor each other in math. But the sign on the door still says writing center. Other things were like collaborations with other organizations on campus. Those felt similar. A lot of folks talked about, one person talked about the writing center director training IAs in the school to tutor in all subjects, which is kind of like a version of expansion in a way, but not fully expansion. And then expanding to, oh, we're gonna now tutor research and speaking, or maybe we're gonna tutor math also, but not other subjects. And then in another case, the director talked about maybe shifting their course to a different course in the district, but the center still remaining a writing center. Parting words of wisdom from a high school director. An important step is to have these hopes and fears conversations with students, administrators, teachers, and even tutees as you move into expansion and throughout the process in order to continually adapt and improve. We need to be attentive to people's needs, and that includes the needs of people who like just writing centers, as well as those who want expansion. It's a balance, but with open communication and a vision that is student-centered, you can likely overcome the issues and design a tutoring space that meets the needs of that community by that community. And I love this quote because it brings up so many important things for directors to think about. So I realize I have only left probably about 7 minutes left, but I would love to hear from you all. I will dive into the chat, see if there's anything in there, but also feel free to unmute yourself. And it could be anything. It could be a reaction or a response. It could be anything I've shared. So you have options. You can write them into the Google Doc, you can write them into the chat, you can unmute yourself. Let me see if there are other questions or thoughts in the chat. I see people, oh, that's great. Thank you, Dr. Breezy, for sharing the idea of symbolic reasoning, reasoning equals logic, writing equals logic. Yeah. Rebecca, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think the answers to some of these thoughts in the chat are really sitting down first, maybe individually, and then maybe with your lead tutors, and really crafting like, what is the mission for your center? Is there an argument for keeping writing at the forefront? And really consider all sides of it. And hopefully some of these quotes and some of the things I've shared have helped you look at both sides. It's very context specific. I see, Katie, you've shared that your kind of writing center with a math add-on. That's so interesting. And I would love to hear maybe in future conversations, or if anyone has experience with this and wants to follow up via email, the difference between training someone to be a math tutor and training someone to be a writing tutor. Because I found that they were kind of divergent in a lot of ways, which is fascinating to me, you know, just the way different disciplines work. Let's see, some other thoughts. Oh, and thank you all, those of you who are sharing that you would be willing to be interviewed. That's so lovely. I will save the chat so that I remember who to follow up with. Yeah, I mean, I was really inspired by conversations with Amber Jensen years ago about ways that she would invite, this is just a writing center, but inviting faculty in and saying like, do you want to be a guest lecturer today? And then she's in the room too, being able to hear like, oh, what's happening in this other discipline that she can then learn as a writing center director while her tutors learn. And I just think that's always a win-win. Increasing communication about what's happening in our isolated classrooms is something we all need in the secondary context, don't we? And post-secondary, honestly. But thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. And I think that plan of soliciting help from others in your institution is so wise. And it's something that I do mention in the article that's coming out in JPTSS, because that was key for me, even just for my confidence and being like, I know I'm just an English teacher, but, and I hear from, let's see, Melissa's saying, yeah, so this was, Melissa knows because she was in the school, that there was a lot of inviting folks in and acting like, I really have a lot to learn from you all, which helped them realize their own expertise. Let's see, Dr. Brizzi, I wonder about a possible drop-in writing orient. Yes, okay, so this is something that came up, especially from post-secondary directors, is this concern about research is not as big of a focus in the Learning Center world. And so the concern about, oh my gosh, research is part of my identity and it's important for making our work visible and making our work improve. And will the research component of my work be dismissed by administration now that I'm in a different context? That's a very real concern. I didn't hear that as much from the secondary world because y'all are busy with the other important parts of your job. Like research is often, there's not much time. I mean, there really isn't. I know it's 10:46 and so we need to sign off, but let me just put my, well, that's the crazy list of references that you can go through on your own in the Google folder. But there's, oops, shoot. My email, I'll just throw it in the chat in case you missed it on that last slide. Thank you all for participating and thank you for all these recommendations in the chat. I'm gonna copy the chat before we close the meeting. Hopefully that will be possible. Yes, okay. Thank you again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.